should not be something that we attribute to, as I heard when I was growing up, the quote, ignorance of the slaves. What it shows you is just how committed the people in Texas, the white slave owners in Texas, were to the system of slavery. They were literally keeping people against the law, right? And so what it should show us is just how committed they were to maintaining the status quo. And we still deal with that very resistant disposition on the part of those who want to curtail the power, particularly the voting power right now that we're dealing with in Texas. So yes, we have Senator Cornyn who has supported the passage of Juneteenth becoming a national holiday. He supported that, but at the same time, we have the governor in Texas and those who are supporting him trying to do everything they can to undermine voting rights. Also, I'd like to mention that in terms of education, African American history can now be added to the high school curriculum, right? But then now you have these governors signing saying that they don't want critical race theory in classrooms. So again, we're taking steps forward, but we have to be aware that there's always going to be a backward push against the gradual, really, not only just emancipation, but socioeconomic parity. That also is something that we're still struggling with. So yes, we're making progress, and we've made progress, but there's never going to be a moment where we don't have to continue to move forward and fight for what we know is right.
So as you look at the passage of this bill and it being signed into recognition as a national holiday, how do you see that really substantiating the plight of African American people in this country? And how does it strengthen and bolster now the argument? Because, and when I say the argument against white supremacy, the argument against those critics of critical race theory, those who are trying to absolve themselves of any responsibility, not only for creating a systemic racist society, but in the perpetuating of the systemic racism. How do you see the recognition of this as now giving educators and people like you the foundation to say, okay, no, like when we go back and look at the
Right.
documents, how does that help us now move forward in this argument?
Well, it gives us a national space, right? That here we now have the 12th holiday added to the list of national holidays. So you can hang a lot on that as an educator. You have a bona fide reason to teach about slavery. You have a bona fide reason to teach about resistance to emancipation, resistance to freedom, right? And you have a bona fide reason to organize programs away from our campuses, on campus, and also off campus. You can interact with members of the community through what we've already done through parades and these informal ways to celebrate the holiday. So you do have something to stand on, right? And you do have a reason to discuss what happened during the period of slavery and to discuss really the struggle, that you see as people are trying to move forward and live better lives.
I think it's interesting. We were talking yesterday off the air, and I was saying that one of the, I think, powerful points of this legislation is to actually address some of the issues of white fragility, people who emotionally have been able to disconnect from their intellect. And this, just the declaration, quite honestly, that we are free. That
Yes.
we are free, and there were promises that were made in the context of that freedom beyond just 40 acres and a mule.
Right.
To me, this seems to lay a foundation for greater arguments against redlining, arguments against gerrymandering, arguments against so many things that have plagued us as a people, this gives us an opportunity to go back to source documents and to say, hey, no, this is the way it's supposed to be. And just recognize that this is a national holiday. Well, guess what it was intended to do and to produce? Am I off track with that? Or
no, you're not. And the phrase that really does that for us with this, with the Juneteenth proclamation, really is the phrase absolute equality. Absolute equality. And so, I can see the t-shirts now, so that drive toward absolute equality is something that we can definitely use, because we have all these discussions about diversity and inclusion and equity. Well, what about that? Have we achieved absolute equality? And for the reasons that you've mentioned, redlining, continued segregation in our educational systems, and I'd like to say underfunding is a real problem, especially in higher education, right? Here in Texas, when you look at the historically Black colleges that are in our state, and really throughout the South, and you compare their coffers to the support that is going to historically white institutions, there's really no comparison in many instances, where people who are professors at these various institutions, who go to many of the same schools, when they come to historically Black colleges and universities, they are going to be taking a pay cut when they walk through the door. You understand? And so there's equity in funding for education that we need in higher education as well. So we can continue to talk about the need for absolute equality, which we don't have in higher education at this moment.
yeah, and so for our listening audience, when we talk about absolute equality, if you look at, for example, the funding for the University of Texas, Texas A&M University, versus the funding for HBCUs like Texas Southern University and Prairie View A&M University, just to name a couple of state schools, there's not even a comparison.
This is really not.
Yeah.
No.
And again, I think you're absolutely right. That watchword, absolute equality, that phrase needs to be the phrase that we continue to put forth, because there's no question, when you look at what's done and you look at what was promised, what
Right.
was promised is a far cry
Didn't.
from what we see actualized. As a history professor, I don't know, does this change for you as you think about your upcoming classes and students, and you think about your syllabuses? What
Right.
adjustments do you make as you talk about Juneteenth and you talk about African American history, which is the subject that you teach here at Texas Southern University?
Right. Well, because I teach African American history, Juneteenth is always part of the discussion, especially when I'm teaching a summer class, because we're actually in school during the holiday. So what it does, though, is it again, what I love about it is that it allows me to start thinking about the role that Texas Southern University has played in the civil rights movement, the role that Texas Southern University graduate Al Edwards had in making Juneteenth a state holiday, right? And so we see TSU, I like to tease out the history of TSU and the role that folks on that campus continue to play in championing the progress of African Americans and people of color. It tends to be a hub for many of the state legislators, many of whom graduated from Thurgood Marshall School of Law. So it's part of that broad continuum. And then just seeing that again, here you have these formerly enslaved people in Texas who chose to celebrate, which is really a great idea. They chose to commemorate the fact that now they are free. And so we see it's like Texas right now has become, it's launched to the national stage as a state, and it's largely because of the efforts of African American Texans who want to acknowledge what Juneteenth did, and also to say we need to keep moving forward because we have not achieved absolute equality. So the syllabus it's not that the syllabus is going to change, because I teach African American history all the time, but I can say what I say with a whole lot more force, right? Because now what has happened in Texas, the celebration of the emancipation of slaves is now a national experience. And that is very important.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. DZ Cofield, and you're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz, your community station, KTSU 90.9 on the FM dial, ktsuradio.com, and on the Real World, Real Talk podcast network, live with Dr. Karen Kasi. So, Doc, here's what I need to know from you. There are a lot of people, and I think some people who are just frustrated. There are a lot of younger people who are saying this is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
We need real change. We need passage of the George Floyd
Mm-hmm.
criminal reform bill. We need John Cornyn to stand with us on that. We
Mm-hmm.
need to address the issue of gerrymandering in our state. We need to address the fact that there are so many people in the state of Texas, predominantly poor and minority, who are uninsured or underinsured. We need to address voter suppression. We need to address these issues. And my comeback has been it's not an either or
Right.
argument, that it's really a both and. Help us and help somebody who may be very critical of this recognition, this national holiday. Help them to understand this in the greater context of our history and how we can leverage this to move forward.
Right. This moment or this celebration, the emancipation of the slaves, is wonderful, wonderful to acknowledge that they have been freed. The document also helps us to revisit what the intent was of the document. And it also gives us an opportunity to say and see how African Americans in Texas even then said, this is not enough. It's okay to say it's not enough. But I think it's also important to recognize that the document provides a stage. It provides a stage, something that we can actually look at. We can look at it alongside the 13th Amendment. We can look at it alongside the 14th Amendment. We can look at it alongside the various pieces of civil rights legislation that came out of Texas, Smith v. Allwright. We can look at it alongside the George Floyd bill. It's all part of a continuum of the struggle for equality and justice. So it's not something that we need to deny. We can use it to continue to fuel our desire to see things move forward in a very positive way at all levels, socioeconomic, political, and in other ways for people of African descent.
So as we move forward now, the question is, okay, we had the celebration. There have been a number of celebrations held around the county, around the country, including in Texas. We saw in Galveston, where it was originally declared, we saw a celebration there. Interestingly enough, even though State Representative Al Edwards was able to propose the legislation and get it recognized by the state of Texas, Galveston did not recognize it as a holiday until just recently. So as we see this happening, and you look back at our history, what should we look for as mile markers to success, as mile markers to change? Because to me, this is, I don't think it's overstating it, opening up a new chapter in terms of this talk around race, not necessarily racial reconciliation, but just this country coming to grips with the heinous act of chattel slavery and what was done to descendants of those Africans that came to this country in chains. Uh, what are some things that we should look for to say, okay, we're on the right track in your opinion?
Well, we look at all of the areas any area where we see, where we want to see change, we want to move toward absolute equality, we should see ourselves in a position to lift every voice. So each of us has an area that we can work on to help improve things for members of our community. I'm in education. Someone else may be in the lending industry. Someone else may work as a pastor. Whatever lane you are in, you can take that phrase, absolute equality, and you can let it guide what you do. Some of you are already active in politics. We have elections coming up. Keep that mantra in front of you, absolute equality, and help someone who is running for public office whose views you believe are going to move things forward. So we can use the energy from this moment to continue to press for absolute equality in all areas. And trust me, we need all hands on deck. We also need to make sure that we're educating our children about their history. And I would really strongly suggest, again, that you look at those documents, because when we talk about legislation, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about laws. And so what we want to do is look at those laws that have impacted our lives and look at ways to actually, we need to pay attention to what needs to be changed and what needs to be moved forward. So we should have our ears really close to the ground right now. We should be listening to what's happening in the state Senate, right, or the state legislature here in Texas. We should be paying close attention to what folks are attempting to do when it comes to voter suppression, and we should be thinking of an equal and opposite reaction, right? Planning strategies to make sure that our voices are heard.
Well, I tell you what, I think you're so on point, that the phrase absolute equality needs to become our mantra.
That's it.
What we say in every setting, whether it's healthcare or criminal justice reform or education, equal pay for equal work,
Yes.
the funding of institutions and universities and the like in our community.
And if,
Absolute equality, it is what it is.
and if I can add too, it's very important to know where the source of power is in the arena in which you are working or serving. Because sometimes, we get a job and we're really not aware of the forces that really are in control. And we have to understand the importance of knowing where the locus of power is. And we also need to understand what rules and regulations are governing the areas in which we're working. Because very often, sometimes the problems that we have, they're based on our not totally understanding the locuses or loci of power in the structure that we're working in. And so in addition to doing whatever our job is, we need to understand the power source in those places. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. I was talking to someone and they were talking about this place where they were working. And they said that at this particular institution, when they began to hire young people, most of the people they were hiring were coming from the University of Texas and Texas A&M. And so who's in a position in that place to say, well, why aren't we hiring students from Texas Southern University in Prairie View? Right? So we need these people in strategic places in their places of employment, or those who are even business owners, to be aware of what they can do to help move things towards absolute equality for people of color in our state. So there are different ways that we can all make a contribution. I do what I do as an educator, but those who are in the business community, you can look at whom you're hiring and you can say, well, we're going to go and recruit at TSU. We're going to go and recruit at Prairie View A&M. And so making sure that we're not only educating our students, but we have to make sure that they find gainful employment when they leave our institution. So there's a lot that we can work on. And I think it's a great moment, really, where we have the 12th holiday. As I said, that number 12, it's associated with self-improvement. It is associated also with peace and harmony. And so we know that we cannot really have peace or harmony if we do not have justice. So that's what we want to make sure we do. We want to hang on to that phrase, absolute equality. And the final thing I'll say, we want to also open up that definition that you see in the document that talks about these people now being able to earn wages for their work. We don't need only to be wage earners. We need to be job creators. And so we can take that as a stepping stone to say, yes, we have worked. Our people have definitely worked. And now we need to make sure we're moving toward ownership and creating employment for others. So there's a lot that we can take from this document that I think moves us in a very positive direction as a community.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is the document is not a long document.
No.
It's not difficult to read. It's really very straightforward, very direct, and I think back to the previous national holiday that was created in 1993, the King holiday. And there are those who were concerned when that holiday was designated and identified that it would be commercialized. And there's been a very intent effort to make that a day of service.
Mhm.
When you think about Juneteenth,
Mhm.
what would you say to our listening audience is a focus that we need to have for Juneteenth? If the King holiday is a day of service to
Mhm.
humanity, what would be a mantra for us to hold on to try to really flesh out this idea of absolute equality? What's an area that you would encourage people to focus on as we move now to the day after Juneteenth?
I love that question. That is a great question. So I would like to say that since it is a national holiday, we need people from all communities in the United States of America to look around them on that day and say, have African Americans in my area, have they achieved absolute equality? Am I doing what I can to help African Americans achieve absolute equality? And African Americans themselves can look and say, what am I doing to ensure that I am gaining absolute equality? So I think that phrase is a very powerful one, right? So we can take it and interpret it in our different areas and say, have we achieved absolute equality? And if we haven't, what do we need to do to help us make good on the promise of freedom?
Dr. Karen, thank you so much for being with us on
Thank you.
tonight. We could talk about this for multiple episodes of our show. I think it's just a much more powerful moment than people fully realize. I think we're looking at it from a very cursory perspective and not seeing just how much power is in the document itself and
Right.
being recognized, what it means to us. I think back to an only example I can think of, to be honest with you, and it doesn't compare in terms of significance, but I remember when there was a lot of talk of the University of Houston. You were here at the time, when there was talk in the state legislature regarding the University of Houston absorbing Texas Southern University,
Right.
and Texas Southern University would become part of the University of Houston. And I can remember, and I don't remember who it was. You may be able to remember who it was, but there was an African American legislator who came out in support of that, and it
Mm.
was a female, and she was in support of it, and her rationale was, because there is a law that states whoever the eldest university or institution is, the new entity must take on that name. And
Mhm.
Texas Southern is older than the University of Houston. She came out and
Exactly.
said, "Sure, yeah, yeah, combine." And man, that'll just make Texas Southern University bigger. And of course, when everybody heard that, they was like, and we heard about the University of Houston absorbing Texas Southern University. And
Mhm.
it just seems like, I think, in the passage of this uh, bill and in the creation of this national holiday, I think some people are going to get more than they bargained for when we
Yeah.
start thinking about and reading this document and now holding people accountable to what they
Mm.
recognize as a national holiday. Thank you
Right.
so much for being with us
Thank
tonight on
you.
Talk.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I appreciate you so much. That was Dr. Karen Kasi here from Texas Southern University, professor of history. She's a tremendous lady, and just thankful for her taking time to be with us. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment, and we're going to talk about Father's Day and what it means in our community. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Real World Real Talk. Man, I am excited to have you with me on today. I want to thank Dr. Karen Kasi again for being with us to talk about Juneteenth and help us make sense out of this holiday and, more importantly, what it means to us. There are a lot of people who've been celebrating Juneteenth who have never read the Declaration. And if you don't know what the Declaration is, then you don't know how powerful it is. And I would venture to say, I don't know, I would venture to say many of the legislators who voted for it have probably never read the document. I mean, think about this. Do you think people would have voted in a bipartisan way to celebrate the Jubilee, the Juneteenth, the freeing of slaves, when the document clearly states absolute equality will be given to the slaves? Like, do you think they actually would have voted for that? I don't know. My personal opinion is I don't think so. So it's there. And now it is a national holiday. And now we can take that document and start having some very, very real conversations. The fact that there wasn't absolute equality, which was the reason that it needed to be said, and how much was done to make sure absolute equality was never reached and was never sustained. So when you hear somebody talk about, for example, they are not in favor of reparations, black and white people, right? When they say that they're not in favor of the slaves or the descendants of slaves receiving reparations, not only do we see evidence of every group that was wronged in this country and by white people in this country receiving reparations, even the doggone slave owners got reparations because they quote unquote lost their property. The people who were the property, who were set free, never got any sense of reparations. And when you listen to somebody like Senator Mitch McConnell of the state of Kentucky make an ignorant statement that black people have received reparations because of the civil rights legislation that was passed under the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson, and because President Barack Obama was elected as the president. So therefore, we have received reparations. I mean, if you, that's ASA 9, ASA 10, and ASA 11. So, man, this document, I would encourage you to look it up. I would encourage you to read that Juneteenth document. I think you will be inspired by it. Now, we've just got about 14 minutes or so left, and I want to spend the rest of the day talking about Father's Day. Father's Day, man, today is Father's Day. And I told you earlier, man, we had such a great celebration of fatherhood at the Barbara Jordan International Preschool. Man, those brothers came out, the grandfathers and the fathers and the uncles, the father figures came, and it was such a blessing. It was such a blessing. And one of the statements I made to them, I'm so encouraged by the commitment to fatherhood of my youngest son, Brandon. His namesake, Brandon Jr., is now just over a year old. And just to see the kind of father he is. And I'll call Brandon sometimes and I'll say, hey, man, what's going on? What you doing? He said, Pop, let me call you back. I'm getting ready to read with Brandon. Or, hey, I'm getting ready to put the baby down, and man, just to see his interaction, my bonus son, Bryce, to see his interaction with his girls and the love that he has for his children and the love that they have for him. Man, it's just so inspiring to me. And let me be honest with you. I wish I had somebody in my life who modeled for me and encouraged me and instructed me on how to be a better dad. I was there, but I was working, and I really did not understand when my children were growing up the emotional support that they needed from me. I was working, I was hustling, man. I was trying to make sure there was food on the table, and there's something to be said for that. But I know I missed some very important opportunities to invest and to pour in the life of my own children. And I've tried to make adjustments and changes as I've moved forward, because one of the things that I've learned as I'm getting older is that I never stopped being their father, and I never stopped being a dad, and even being a grandfather now. I still have a responsibility to guide my children and to share my experiences with them, and hopefully keep them from making some of the mistakes that I made. One of the things that I want to encourage the fathers who are out there to do is to be transparent with your children. You know, many times when we tell our children what not to do, we don't let them know that we're telling them that out of our experience of what we have done, right, and the mistakes that we have made. And I would always tell my children, I said, look, no, avoid this, don't do this, don't do this. And I can remember my oldest, my daughter, one time saying to me, she said, well, Dad, she said, we want to make our own mistakes. You made your mistakes, so you need to let us make our mistakes. And I said to her, I said, sweetheart, I said, I understand that. I said, but here's what I want you to do. I don't want you to repeat the mistakes that I made. I want you to learn from my example, right? Don't repeat the mistakes that I made. If you're gonna make mistakes, be creative. Come up with something so stupid that I never thought of doing. And then I can give you dap on that. I'll be like, oh man, look, I never thought of something that crazy. But don't make the same mistakes I made. If I ran into the brick wall and the wall was hard and I got a concussion and I'm telling you the brick wall is hard, don't run into the same wall. I mean, run into something else and tell me, hey, that steel vat is hard. Run into something else. But don't make the same mistakes that I've made. And for us as fathers, those are things that we want to try to avoid. I always tell people we are born as males. We become men by choice, and we become fathers through experience, not just the procreating of a child, but we become dads when we make a commitment to invest in the lives of our children. And so I want to encourage all of the fathers who are out there to do your part to invest in the lives of your children. And to the children who are out there, I want to give you a word that I think will help you even find healing in your own life, and that's forgiveness. The truth of the matter is, man, none of our children come with a manual. And I have three children who grew up in the house together, and all three of them have uniquely different personalities and perspectives on the world, even though they grew up in the same house with their mother and their father. They have totally different views and perspectives on the world, and have taken different paths in life. Not one better than the other. They've just found their own way in life. And I want all of the children who are out there, and it doesn't matter how old or how young you are, if you're listening and you have this ability, I want to encourage you to forgive, uh, because the truth of the matter is, most fathers and mothers do the best they can with what they have. Many of us were ignorant of the responsibility. We did not understand what it entailed. And I think if you have your own children, it is much easier to have a child than it is to raise a child. And it's much easier to make a child than it is to raise a child. And we've seen so many shifts in parenting philosophies and thoughts about how to rear children in the world that we live in today. And I'm a firm believer that in general, women tend to raise children to live at home, and men raise their children to live in the world. And there can be a conflict in that philosophy of how to raise your children. And that conflict will be present. Some people think it's only present when you have, for example, a blended family. But that conflict is present when you have both parents of the same children living in the home and being raised in the household. Many times, women raise their children to live at home, and men, by rule, tend to raise their children to live in the world. But the truth of the matter is we can all do better. And one of the ways to find healing in your own life is to forgive, is to let go. And you can forgive whether or not a person asks for forgiveness. And for somebody, your father may be gone. That person who wasn't there, you can no longer contact, but you still have the ability to forgive. And forgiveness is simply giving up the right to be angry, to recognize the frailty that we all have. We are all imperfect beings serving a perfect God. And so, how do we understand that and highlight the positives instead of focusing on the negative? V. Michael McKay and Truth, they're coming up next. And Mike and I had a conversation a couple of years ago. And great conversation. Matter of fact, we had it on the show, if you remember, talking about the commandment to honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that God will give you. And what's interesting about that promise is that there's nothing in that promise that talks about whether or not your mother and father are worthy of that. It doesn't talk about if your parents are good, you should honor them. There's a respect that you are to give for your parents. And what's interesting is if you walk around with hatred and malice and meanness in your heart towards them, not only do you harm your relationship with your parent, but you really harm your relationship with God. And so I really want to encourage those of you to take the opportunity to release it, to let it go. For me, I had to recognize the brokenness that was in my father and how that brokenness affected my life, affected my younger sister's life. I found my older sister that I had not seen in 49 years. I saw her when I was a little kid and was able to reconnect with her after 49 years. And I could see the brokenness that's in her that was caused by my dad, right? And then I can see the brokenness in her children. I can see the brokenness in my children. I can see the brokenness in my nieces and nephews. And the question is, when will it stop? Right? There are many of you who are spiritually minded who are listening to the show today, and we talk about generational curses. And here's what's interesting about generational curses when you look at them in the Bible. A generational curse, as we define it, is not something that is projected upon us. It is something that is passed down by us. And many times it is passed down very subtly and subconsciously. So we're not aware that we're passing down this brokenness of unhealed hurts, this brokenness of anger, this brokenness of anxiety. And so I want to encourage you to do your part to make sure that it stops with you and make sure you find healing for your life on this Father's Day. All right? This is Dr. DZ Cofield for Real World, Real Talk signing off. I've got to get out of here and make way for truth. V. Michael McKay, David Goldstein, Asia, they're all in the house. Until next time, God bless is my prayer. Hey, bud. All right, everybody, take care. Talk to you. Bye-bye.